I'm Miley Barrett, a reference librarian and local history librarian at the Reading Public Library, and tonight's program is a collaboration between Reading, Wakefield, Linfield, and Melrose Public Libraries. I'd like to thank Karen Stearns, Wakefield, Catherine Decker, Samantha Topman, Linfield, and Erin Lewis, Melrose. Tonight's program has been generously sponsored by the Friends of the Reading Public Library. This program is being recorded and will be available on one of our media sites on our website at the Reading Public Library. This is a Zoom webinar, so both your camera and mic are off. Therefore, if you have any questions, please type them using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll ask Doug your questions at the end of the presentation. I have enabled captioning, which you can control. On your toolbar, there's something called Live Transcripts at the bottom, and when you click on it, you have the option to turn it on or off. Headlines about global insect decline and 3 billion fewer birds in North America are a bleak reality check about how ineffective our current landscape designs are at sustaining the plants, insects, and animals that sustain us. Such losses are not an option if we wish to continue our current standard of living on the planet Earth. The good news is that none of this is inevitable, and tonight Doug Tallamy will discuss simple steps that each of us can and must take to reverse declining biodiversity, and will explain why we are nature's best hope. Doug Tallamy is a T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Mr. Tallamy has published several books, including Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens. This was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, which he co-authored with Rick Dark and was published in 2014. Doug's new book, Nature's Best Hope, was released in February 2020, and it's a New York Times bestseller. He has been awarded the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence. Also, the 2008 AHSBY Morrison Communication Award and the Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. So we're very honored to have you here today, Doug. Thank you. And I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eileen. Let me screen share. Okay, I think we're ready. Thanks for coming, everybody, tonight. I do want to tell you what my idea of Nature's Best Hope is, but before I do that, I want to talk about what happened in the East. First, I'm going to brighten my screen here a little bit. There we go. I want to talk about what happened in the East in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, stuck its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down, and that's a very, very dangerous time for this insect because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. In about 30 seconds, down it goes. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and makes a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa and then remains there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. at the end of that extension, and they take those mouthparts and they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after the acorn weevil leaves, it leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they find a new acorn, they get excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they work very hard. In about 30 minutes, the entire colony has moved into the new acorn. And they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in, and this is where they will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They allow oaks to move faster and farther than any other tree genus in the world. The relationship between witch hazels, which bloom late in the fall, and winter moths, which turn out to be the major pollinators of witch hazels. They do it at night, so that's why we hadn't seen it for a long time, but this is one of them, the bicolored sallow. These guys are flying late as well. I caught this guy on Christmas Eve. And the relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That is what they feed their young. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia, because that is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them are highly specialized on the pollen of particular plants. So for example, in New England, there's at least 13 species of native bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk about nature's specialized relationships all night long. The point though is that today these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, he stood on the edge and looked out over the great view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, leaving the country as it was is no longer an option because we didn't. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states it's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done that. I wonder why we've done that as well. And I don't know, but I imagine that we thought the earth, our nest, was so large, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And now we're seeing those consequences with headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. Almost a third of its North American bird population gone. The UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this as if it's an option. I mean, they might as well say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then just go on to the next headline. We can't lose oxygen. We can't lose 1 million species because we depend on these species. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment and thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that box. It's secure that it'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those small efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody on the planet. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, your own E.O. Wilson right there in Harvard emeritus at this point, greatest entomologist of all times for sure, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects on planet Earth. And he did it in a paper way back in 1987 called The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystem so drastically that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services. These are our life support systems produced by healthy ecosystems, not just for us, but for everything that's out there. What do plants deliver for other life forms? They produce oxygen, pretty important. They clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture is enormously important in today's world. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, taking the carbon in that molecule and building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Once it's in the soil, by the way, it's extremely stable. Unless you turn it over, it'll stay in that soil for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, they convert sunlight into food. You know, without plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, which would be a trick. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea. We've got 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. So taking huge areas of the planet out of production for status symbols, that's really what lawn is just not a good idea. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who've been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer in a given place, completely wrecking that place, going to another place, doing the same thing over and over again, clearly not sustainable behavior. So Aldo had a dream. He had a dream that we humans were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew that we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine. But he believed that we could learn how to do those things gently enough so that we could do them without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. He wrote about that in the Sand County Almanac. What he never talked about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time is so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he might not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get smaller every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's start on private property. We cannot ignore private property when we're practicing conservation because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because we'll be working on areas that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that support us. We need functional ecosystems everywhere, not just in parks and preserves. There are a lot of options for rebuilding nature that we're not currently taking advantage of, but we could without a whole lot of effort. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? There's 21 million acres in those landscapes. Railroad rights of ways, another 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are big areas. Then we have roadsides, another 17 million acres. And then all the places we live, both in rural areas and suburbia, in our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those landscapes where we all could be practicing conservation. But right now, most of us are not. If you add those areas up, and you can think of others, that's 599 million acres. How big is 599 million acres? It's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, plus California. Even throw Texas in there. Not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation almost anywhere. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm really not using the word correctly. Yes, we want to conserve the nature that's left, but we've got to reconstruct the nature that we have dismantled. That's restoration, but people will say, well, you're never going to put it back exactly the way it was. True enough. But we can create functioning ecosystems by uniting enough of those specialized relationships so that the ecosystem does function once again. It may not be exactly what was in that space beforehand, but it still can function and produce ecosystem services. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks for what run ecosystems. And there's a couple that are essential, like those flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. Remember, flowering plants in particular are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food through photosynthesis, which is then stored in plant parts, mostly leaves. So, okay, now we've got food stored in plants. Well, we've got to get that food to animals or we have no animals. It's that simple. But most animals, most vertebrates, for example, don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, which is typically insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars, we will have failed. We'll have a failed food web. And that's a new way of thinking about what our landscapes need to accomplish. Let's use Carolina chickadee as an example. Now you've got black-capped chickadee up there in the Boston area doing exactly the same thing, practically the same bird. In the wintertime, we see them at our feeders. They're eating seeds. About 50% of their diet is seeds, but when they reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they'll rear their young entirely on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students did recently, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds when they were bringing food to the nest. And the object was to reconstruct the nestling diet for as many birds as she could. So these photographers sent those pictures to Ashley. She got thousands of pictures. She identified the prey items in the beaks. And then these are the results. The green bars for all of these 20 common bird families are the percentage of the nestling diet that is caterpillars. Excuse me. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominate the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of our landscapes. Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So what's special about caterpillars? There are a lot of other insects and spiders out there. Well, one of the things that's special is that the caterpillars are relatively soft prey items. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton, it's cuticle, it's made of chitin, it's undigestible, so the birds don't want a lot of that. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. They take that beak and they just stuff it down there like a plunger. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, a lot of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? Caterpillars are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And much of a beetle is undigestible. And beetles have a lot of sharp edges. And finally, caterpillars turn out to be the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. You're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates don't make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife Cindy makes sure I have lots of carrots to get my beta carotene, and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, and lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And when I eat those things, they stimulate my immune system. I can't think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he takes those luteins and he makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are they getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course, but carotenoid levels are not equally distributed among invertebrate prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than anything else. Here are the adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are, in the green leaves. And here is the earthworm, way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and a number of others suggest that caterpillars are probably not optional parts of bird diets. It's really looking like they're essential parts of bird diets. So let's say that birds need caterpillars. Make it that simple. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. We have a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. But they're flying all around. Nobody's been able to count that. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to have one successful reproduction in this tiny little bird that's a third of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you would want chickadees to breed in your yard because there's very few other places to breed other than our yards in so many places. You've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we design landscapes without all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly related to the decline in birds that we're measuring. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al., the Smithsonian group that says we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. We divided the terrestrial bird species of North America into two groups, the birds that require insects at some point in their life history and the birds that don't. Things like doves and finches that can reproduce on seeds. Well, the seed eaters, didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years, but the birds that depend on insects on average lost 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that when you lose insects, you lose the birds that depend on that insects. And that conclusion is not rocket science. If you take away the bird food, of course you're going to take away the birds. So I'm thinking we need to re-examine what we're landscaping for. In the past, we have landscaped pretty much exclusively for aesthetics. We want pretty landscapes. Well, now we need to expand that a bit. We need to have pretty landscapes that support a lot of insects, particularly caterpillars, or we're going to lose the life around us. So how do we do that? How do we put caterpillars in our landscapes? You do that by putting the plants that support those caterpillars in our landscapes, and then, of course, not spraying them. And that seems pretty easy, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to choose the plants that are best at supporting caterpillars, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. If you want monarch butterflies in your yard, you can have all the Asian plants you want, all the calorie pear and all the burning bush and barberry and buckthorn and boxwood and hostas, any of the other Asian plants that we put in our yards as decorations, and you won't make a single monarch. The only thing that's going to make a new monarch is milkweeds. That is called host plant specialization, and it turns out host plant specialization is really common in our insect herbivores. Most of them are highly specialized because plants have made them that way. Remember, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they protected their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And that's why most of the insects of the world cannot eat most of the plants of the world. They are too well protected, and that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of those plants. Again, those chemical protections really work. Except we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are highly specialized. They can only eat particular plant lineages for which they have developed the adaptations that allow them to circumvent the chemical defenses in those leaves. So every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. An insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So it picks one or two that are very similar in how they defend themselves, and it gets good at getting around those plants by developing specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, specialized behaviors, life history patterns and behaviors that reduce their exposure to those particular compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with each one of those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. And once they do fall into place, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant lineage. The monarch is locked into eating milkweeds. So if you run out of milkweeds and put in crepe myrtle, the monarch's not going to start eating it just because he doesn't have milkweeds. He's going to die, which is, of course, what monarchs are doing. We have very few left compared to what was here in 1976. And that's why when we bring in plants from other countries, they don't support local food webs. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to reconstruct food webs that support the life around us, that run the ecosystems that we all depend on, we got to pick the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do pick the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres that was part of a farm not long ago, very old farm, been farmed for 300 years. The soil was exhausted. And the last thing they did was to mow it for hay. Well, when you mow for hay in this area, so this is what the house looked like when we built the house. I'm sitting in this window right there. That's my Zoom room. Well, when you mow for hay in this area, you're really mowing the rootstocks of all those invasive plants that are so common here. Multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and miscanthus and on and on and on. You mow that and you call that hay. So when we built the house and everybody stopped mowing, that's what grew back. We had 10 acres of serious tangle of invasive plants. This is my wife, Cindy, who's getting ready to clear those 10 acres. I helped a little bit in the beginning, but you know what? She's outside right now, still keeping those things away. It's a lot of work. There's no doubt about it. And fortunately, she enjoys doing it. But if you have a problem with invasive plants, don't give up. You really can win You just have to be persistent. What was I doing? Well, while Cindy was working, two things. I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I also was putting the plants back. The object here, of course, was to get rid of the non-native plants that don't support the life around us and put the native plants that do support the life around us. And you don't do that unless you rebuild that caterpillar population. So one of my early targets was to bring the Canadian owlet to our property. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue here 300 years ago before they farmed it to death, but long gone. So there's no meadow rue anywhere around us that I know. So I got some seeds from someplace, planted the meadow rue, grew very nicely. But this was early on. I did not have a whole lot of confidence that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even walk out and see how it was doing for at least 2 months. And then I walked by it by accident, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. Still don't know where they came from, but it was a rapid and early success. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to the property. That's the goal, to add species. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful yellow-orange moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some Biden seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It took about a year for the caterpillar, for the moth to find our Bidens. But it has, and now we've got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor on our property, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that should be here. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. It's the only way we're going to get the hackberry emperor. Had to wait 4 years for the butterfly to find our hackberry, but they finally did. A year ago, June, I walked by one of my hackberry trees, and on a single branch, there were 9 hackberry emperor butterfly larvae. I guess it's time for me to do that again, see how they're doing. So now we've added 6 species to the property, and that's how it went. We didn't plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. But along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come, but this is part of the fun. That's what the caterpillars look like. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod looking for these caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear that people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It makes very nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. They're very high in fat, it has good fall color. It climbs our trees without girdling them and without pulling them down. It's an excellent pollinator plant, believe it or not, because the flowers that make these berries, they're not conspicuous. We don't even notice them. So, by the way, when you're planting a pollinator garden, don't plant it for humans. Plant it for the bees you're trying to help. So the flowers don't have to be big and pretty. They just have to be full of nectar and full of pollen. And that's what Parthenocissus Virginia creeper flowers are. And it's the host plant for the large sphinx moths that are the primary diet of nestling cardinals. So things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could get the double-toothed prominent to our property, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you gotta love this guy. I mean, looks like a stegosaurus. It's a specialist on elm. Of course, we didn't have any elm. Most of us lost our elms to Dutch elm disease a long time ago, but there were a few elms that did not die from Dutch elm disease at the University of Delaware. They're enormous. They make lots of seeds. I gathered up some of those seeds from the gutter, planted them, and they grew very nicely. That was 19 years ago. Those trees are 80 feet tall now. And the double-tooth prominent came right away. American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers, just like that. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages I put in our yard, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, well, you know, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oaks when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oaks do for you, and by the way, they grow a lot faster than you think, you can enjoy your oak immediately. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks as acorns, most of them, and a few as, which means they were free, a few as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50. And immediately, the very first year, they started to attract the moths, the caterpillars that run the food webs that support our ecosystem. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the pleasant dagger moth, the delightful dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and many, many more. Hundreds more have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start to rebuild the life on your property. This is what our house looks like today. I'm still sitting in this room right here. I show you this to convince you we're very traditional. We've got lawn here, but we've put a lot of plants back. And I noticed a long time ago that every time I add a new plant lineage to our yard, there's a good chance that I'm providing the opportunity for moth specialists that specialize that plant lineage to join our food web. And 4 years ago, I decided to take a picture of every moth species in our property to just see how many we have. And I'm still at it. And I'm up to 1,067 species of moths that I've photographed so far. And I've added, boy, this spring I've added, I don't know, another 30 or so. So there's still a lot out there that I'm adding. That's more species of moths on our property than all the species of birds in North America. And we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we've got 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why is that important? Well, this is another headline we saw this fall. The World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure that we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3, and it didn't take that long. All we had to do was put the plants back that support those animals, which, you know, when you come right down to it, it's pretty easy. I'm telling you this so that you don't despair when you see these terrible headlines. They're frightening, but they are not inevitable. We can turn it around. We all have to get busy and put the plants that support the life on our planet back, and it'll work. But I know what you're thinking. Well, we've got 10 acres and a lot of people don't. They live in smaller lots in suburbia or cities. Will it work in a smaller lot? That is a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they live in the middle of suburbia. All their neighbors have the big yards. Well, when they moved in, their yard was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, the big invasive in Kirkwood, Missouri. So they got rid of that. Then they planted lots of native plants. They put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their property. And they are up to 149 bird species using their little 0.6 acres in suburban Kirkwood, Missouri. 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of this wall here is one of the runways for O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but it's isolated. It's not connected to any natural area at all. Well, she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, plus a water feature. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that have used her yard, and she's up to 120 species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house. There it is. Well, what about city centers? 82% of us live in cities. Are they going to miss out on all the fun? Well, in 2014, way back in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we've got a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, Monarch's Delight 2014. The first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bee, megachilid bee. I saw a big species and a smaller species. I know they're megachilids because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they also need soft leaves. And leaves of red buds are perfect because they cut out the edges of those leaves, leave these little semicircles. Then they roll up what they cut out into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, then lay an egg on it, and then take that whole package and put it in a crack or a crevice. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to Monarch's Delight. So those leafcutter bees had everything they needed, and I'm sure that's why they were there. Pretty sure that's why there were bumblebees there as well. Remember, bumblebees overwinter as queens. So when they come out in the spring, it's just the queen. There are no workers to help them out. So they've got to start the colony entirely themselves. And what they need is access to a lot of very efficient foraging. They need a lot of flowers with a lot of pollen and a lot of nectar. And that's exactly what redbud supplies early in the season. That's why there were bumblebees there. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs foraging on Monarch's Delight. Now remember, this is 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. 2013 was the low point of the monarch population. In the East, only 3.6% of the monarchs left compared to 1976, I think it was. So here, and this was June, early in the season, very early in the season to be seeing monarchs on the East Coast. So I was excited. Maybe the monarchs weren't going to disappear after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but there was another milkweed there as well. I think it was purple milkweed. So they had the nectar that they needed, but they also had the host plants. They could reproduce. Everything they needed was there. You know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. And that is the strip of nature we're talking about here. There's the Monarch's Delight. 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of Manhattan. The High Line, of course, it was an abandoned elevated railroad. Been abandoned for decades. Finally, somebody went up there and noticed that there were a lot of native plants growing. Nobody had even planted them. So they decided to make it a tourist destination. They renovated it, and it's very successful. Literally millions of people visit the High Line every year. It's always crowded up there. But the things, the monarchs, the bees, they don't care. And this is the amount of nature that's there. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go see the High Line, see the beautiful plantings on the High Line. I'm not much of a city guy. So I always dragged my feet. But, and you know, seeing a beautiful plant with nothing using it is actually depressing to me. But finally he got me there, and in 20 minutes I saw all the things that I just described to you. Somebody's just finished a study of the bees on the High Line. They're up to 30 species that are using it. So I was completely wrong. And I learned that if thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, they can do that anywhere. It's a very positive message. But there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And the first one is we've got to shrink the area that we have in lawn, because we got way too much area in lawn, more than 40 million acres. And that's a 2005 statistic. Believe me, the amount of lawn has not gone down. 40 million acres, that's the size of New England that is in an ecological deadscape. Why? Well, it's a status symbol. You know, it's a symbol of the rich, and we all want to show our neighbors how rich we are and how well we can follow the rules. Keep it manicured, keep it short, keep it dead. So we can still have our status symbol. We can still show off to the neighbors, but let's cut the area of lawn in half. And if we do that, if we put plants in half the area we have lawn now, that'll give us 20 million acres to create a new national park. If we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, plus Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we'll have the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put some part of nature right at home? You get the opportunity to develop, either for the first time or redevelop, a personal relationship with the natural world. And you can do it at your own time and your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, millions of other people are there with you. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. Here's the big one, though. You get to experience the natural world alone. I don't know how you're going to develop a personal relationship, not mediated by somebody else, unless you are alone. And this is particularly important for our poor kids who, according to Richard Louv, they're all suffering from nature deficit disorder. They simply do not have exposure to the living things on our planet. We're trying. We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with the teacher. They drive for an hour. They walk around a natural area. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And I'm sure that's better than nothing, but that's really an exposure to 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If their home landscape is rich enough that there's actually something alive there, they can go outside and discover it and develop a relationship with it all on their own. Alone, no parental supervision. Let them work it out by themselves. Remember, our kids are the future stewards of our planet. And if they don't have a personal relationship with what they're stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards, guaranteed. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a lawn with a hedge, a tiny lawn with a tiny hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And she discovered that and sent me this slide to demonstrate how you hunt lizards. You get down on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you take care of the lizard. You learn how to steward the natural world. And there's your personal relationship. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture the other day, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinisty's book, Nature Play at Home. Gives you dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to nature right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. And by that, I mean you're going to put in your location and the amount of area that you're converting from lawn to native plantings. Just estimate it. And when you do that, your little piece of your county will light up with a firefly. You'll get to see who else is doing it, and you'll get to see it's like a thermometer of the amount of acreage that we're converting, getting towards that 20 million acres. This is our attempt at social media. You know, I've been talking to the choir for 15 years. And the choir is great, but we've got to get everybody on board, all those people that don't have a clue that where they live is an important piece of the planet. And if social media will get them interested, then good, we're going to do it. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that we take out of lawn? Well, some of those plants have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. And if you take that stone out, the arch falls down. Well, I'm calling these plants keystone plants because if you take them out of our food web, the food web collapses. Why? Because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which means 86% of our plants, our native plants, aren't contributing all that much. So think of the keystone plants in your yard as the 2x4s holding up the ecological house that you're building. They're essential to holding up that house. You're not going to build a house out of wallpaper. But once you have them in place, you're not through building your house. You have to put many of the other plants in. So the question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But there are a lot of natives that aren't contributing all that much. So let's focus on the ones that are really productive, better than the ones that are benign, just sitting there, and much better than the ecologically destructive ornamental plants that we're so fond of, the ones that become invasive, the burning bush, the barberry, the Callery pear, all of those guys that are biologically polluting, ecologically castrating the natural areas around us. I get an email once in a while from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether or not that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because nativity is not the metric anymore. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. So they're there, but they're not contributing to the local food web. What is contributing more than anything else is our oaks. Oaks support 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states and over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to our oaks. And this is an example of how powerful a keystone plant can be in your yard, looking at what the oaks are doing in my yard. Now remember, I've taken pictures of 1,067 moss species so far. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet, I will. And out of that 1,067 species, 935 have known host plants. So there's more than 100 we don't know what they're eating. Out of the 935 species, 278 use oaks. Now we've got 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is Quercus, the oaks. And we've got hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species diversity. Imagine what would happen to the species diversity in our property if we took oaks out of the system. That's the power of keystone plants. How do you find out what a keystone plant is where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website. You put in your zip code and the rank list of woody and herbaceous plants ranked in terms of their ability to support caterpillars will pop up for your county. Now notice I say, and this is what a typical list would look like, and I stopped because I ran out of room. I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and I say I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I say I want to buy a willow, they're going to sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, could very well be a European birch, or a maple could be a Japanese maple. You got to specify that you want a native member of these important genera, because if you get non-native members, you're reducing caterpillar use on average by 65%. We've done that experiment. These are the major herbaceous plants, so goldenrods, the various genera. Asters were broken up into sunflowers, particularly the perennial sunflowers, lead the list in terms of the caterpillars they're making, but also in terms of the specialist bees they support. Those 3 genera alone will support over 40 species of specialist bees that can only reproduce on their pollen. So if you don't have them in your yard, you've lost the opportunity to support 40 species of native bees. And if you live in Canada, you don't, but some people do. There's a similar website up there. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone Plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. And that, of course, is not the goal. There's a lot of recent research coming out, a lot of it from Europe, very convincingly demonstrating that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect decline. And these are all the ways that lights kill insects at at the lights, and particularly those really important moths making those really important caterpillars. You know, to me, this is good news because we must turn around insect declines. We've got to find out what's wrong and we've got to fix it. And if one of the major causes is light pollution, all we have to do is turn out the lights, flick a switch. What could be easier than that? And that, you know, we're definitely getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn that light off over my garage because if I do, the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is the bad man does not come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because those are the yellow wavelengths are the least attractive to night flying insects. If we all switched out our white lights for yellow lights overnight, we would save billions of insects, and we'd also save billions of dollars because we're using LEDs, which are really energy efficient. Okay, we're gonna shrink the lawn. We're gonna put in Keystone Plants. We're gonna turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all our insects. We just have no end to the way we're killing our insects. No wonder there's insect declines. This is a booming business all over the country. And Mosquito Joe would say, well, you know, don't worry because this is a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids made from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product as well. So I'm not sure that's a good argument. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes, and that is not even close to true. I don't know if you saw the headlines last fall during monarch migration, the huge monarch kills after they use mosquito fogging, hundreds of monarchs dead on the ground. So yeah, it's not good. The big thing is it doesn't work. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the population. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50% of the population, not even close to reaching effectiveness, which means he has to keep coming back and back and back, and you have to keep paying him, and he's expensive. So you're paying a lot of money for something that doesn't work, but kills all the other insects. If you really want to kill mosquitoes, get a bucket. People say, how big a bucket? It doesn't matter. The bigger, the better. Fill it full of water and put in a handful of straw or hay and let it ferment for a couple of days. Put it in the sun, let it ferment for a couple of days. You're building up the diatoms and the algae in your bucket, and that becomes irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes. The females that want to lay their eggs will lay in your bucket. Then you put in a mosquito dunk. You get this at the hardware store. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. So you put that dunk in there and the mosquito larvae eat it and they die. It's really targeted. It only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquitoes. So if you get a dragonfly in here, it's not going to hurt it. If your dog drinks it or a bird drinks it, not going to hurt it a bit. So here you have a targeted response to controlling mosquitoes that's cheap and it works. The fourth thing we need to do is to design landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branch, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but not just on oaks, but any of the trees. The caterpillars developing on the trees, most of them finish growing and then drop off the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil and then pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We're too neat for that. We get rid of it. We mow and compact the grass, the soil that's underneath the tree, so that it's way too hard for a caterpillar to wiggle under. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs, caterpillars grow, and then they drop down and die. I am convinced that this type of landscaping, which you know we do everywhere, is one of the major causes of insect decline. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. This is what most people do. They put a tree in the middle of a lawn. Nobody's measured, believe it or not, how well caterpillars survive in a situation like this, but I guarantee they survive better in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then a layered landscape. Maybe a dogwood here, a native azalea, ferns, ground cover. Caterpillars drop down into a safe site. If the soil's not compacted, they can easily get beneath the soil. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them. There's leaf litter underneath there that they can spin their cocoon in. Survivorship will be much higher, guaranteed. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around your trees. The trees will love it, and there's safe sites for those caterpillars. This is where you can use your ground covers, your wild ginger, your mayapple, your foam flower. There's all kinds of species. Your ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maples. Any caterpillar developing on these can fall down into these ferns. Safe sites, even though it's the middle of a city. We can do much better with how we're landscaping under our trees to increase caterpillar survivorship. Another grad student, Desiree Narango. These students have been gone for a couple of years. I miss them very much. Actually, she's up in Massachusetts right now. She did some great work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and the results of her study suggest that there is room for compromise in our plant choices. What she did was compare how well landscapes that are landscaped primarily with native plants sustain chickadee populations over time, compared to landscapes that are built primarily from introduced ornamentals. And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Their nest box is up in everybody's yard, but the chickadees came, they look around and said, there's not enough food here. We're not even gonna try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation took them 1.5 days longer to fledge. And if you put all of that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you're not growing, but you're not shrinking either. It's a sustainable population. If you're reproducing at this rate, where you're making more babies than adults die every year, you've got a growing population. But if you're down here under that dotted line, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. More adults are dying than babies, replacing them every year. Right here, generously speaking, is where those lines overlap, which means you can have up to 30% of your landscape, your woody plants in your landscape. And we focus on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. Up to 30% non-native without destroying the local food web. Now we can't tolerate the invasive plants, no barberry, no burning bush. But you can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtle, you can have your forsythia, because those things don't move. And so this is the zone of compromise that I'm excited about. I'm excited about it because if my message was you can't have any non-native plants, nobody would listen to that. Everybody loves their non-natives. But remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So let's get these native plants back into the landscape and we can tolerate some of these. Can we use native plants in formal landscapes? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. Got this spring. There's nothing more formal than that, and every plant in that design is a native plant. It was taken by a drone. I don't know how high up it was, but it's a big garden. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a fence around it. It formalizes it. It's beautiful. It's functional. It's helping lots of species of native bees. It's not very big, but you could make it bigger. But if everybody does it, it's still very, very useful. Remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time, it's because 30% of our crops depend on pollinators. That's not true. It's about 12%. And I don't like that argument because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. And most people don't live next to a farm. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need these plants? Everywhere where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this design? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Absolutely, and more are doing it all the time. Minnesota kicked it off a few years ago with a program called Lawn to Legume, where it's a cost-sharing program. The state helps pay homeowners to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota native prairie plants. And it's very popular. Lots of people doing that. Pennsylvania's got a new program. It's only 2 years old, but you get up to $5,000 per acre to convert it to a native planting. Very popular. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your yard, we're going to pay you to take care of it, to be a good steward of that species, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri and Fayetteville, Arkansas have a bounty on calorie pairs. You take out your calorie pair, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act, particularly in water-stressed areas in San Antonio. You get a $100 coupon to put in water-efficient native plants and get rid of the water-thirsty non-natives. And of course, the very successful lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California, where you get up to $2 per square foot rebate by putting in xeric plantings instead of lawn. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and this first one is really serious. Somehow, we started to think of nature as optional. In other words, not essential. And if it's not essential, then all the things we consider essential always bump it down the priority list. When push comes to shove, when resources are short, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We need to save wildlife for future generations. We need to save nature for future generations. And it looks like we need to save it for future generations to enjoy. This was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating many of the national parks. Save these places so the future generations can enjoy them. But to me, that suggests nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment is not essential. But we're wrong. Entertainment or nature is essential. We need to save it so that we have future generations, not just so they can enjoy it. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts just to the area where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small and too disconnected to sustain the species that run our ecosystems. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a Persian rug. That is, that's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments. And that's what we've done to our ecosystem. We've fragmented it beyond functionality. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. But I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. I mean, why would you have to designate the ones with ecological significance if every place had significance? Well, every place does have significance. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including your yard, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. We need to glue our rug back together again by putting those powerhouse plants, those keystone plants, back into our landscapes, not just to build biological corridors between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them. We're going to put the plants back where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm. We're going to coexist with nature for the first time in modern history. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't all of us bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have an obligation to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can get rid of their invasive plants, one person can use keystone plants. One person can single-handedly revitalize the ecosystem where they live and enhance their greater local ecosystem rather than degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think of the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about your little piece of the planet. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you're going to focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Volunteer in a park or preserve, a land conservancy. They're going to love you because they're all underfunded, they're all understaffed. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug. We have a few questions. So Karen, did you want to ask them, or I can?
Sure. So actually, most of the questions that we've had are from Gina. Thank you, Gina. The first one she asked was, when you were talking about Virginia creeper, she says, I have Virginia creeper in my yard and I have never seen flowers nor berries.
Well, like all plants, if it's shaded, it doesn't make many flowers or berries. If it's in the sun, it will make them. The flowers are small. You have to look for them. And that's what I mean by thinking like a bee. They're small little greenish yellow things. The berries should be obvious. They turn deep purple in the fall. But again, if it's a ground cover or in deep shade, it's not going to make them. So my guess is you've got a shaded place.
Okay. And she also asked, the winter moth caterpillars are devastating my oaks. It may be good for the birds, but I don't think the oaks could take it. They have almost no leaves. They look like winter. This cannot be good, can it?
Yeah, well, of course, that is, when I say we need insects, when I say we need caterpillars, I'm not talking about non-native caterpillars. I'm not talking about gypsy moth or winter moth or satin moth. Those things are brought over here without their natural enemies, so nothing's keeping them controlled. Birds do eat a lot of caterpillars, thousands and thousands, but the real enemies of caterpillars are the parasitoids, the little wasps that, by the end of the summer, it is difficult to find a caterpillar that's not already parasitized. And winter moths and gypsy moths and those guys don't have any of that control. So yes, it's a huge problem. Actually, for winter moth, the news is good because they have brought under some biocontrol agents, some parasites that are working so well that where they were released, they can't find any anymore, and they can't continue the research. So I talked to the guy who's working on it. He says, "Oh, I'm giving up. I can't find them anymore." So hang on there. That those parasitoids should get there.
That's good news. From David and Christine, I have, how do I get rid of a large burning bush?
You saw it off at the base. You've got to kill the root system or it just keeps coming back. What I do is saw it off the base, and then I paint it with an herbicide, but I'm using very little material. I don't spray because then they're non-targets. You're using much more than you need to. But you paint the outer ring of the stump, and that using an oil-based herbicide is the best. It goes down, it kills the roots, and you only have to do it once. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to use herbicides at all. And I respect that. And you know what? Cindy, my wife, is one of those people. She won't do it. So she's done most of the control on our property without any herbicides. But it is a whole lot more work. So you saw it off at the base, and then every time it sprouts up, you cut it off again. And each time you cut it off, it'll sprout up slower and smaller. But sometimes it can take years to exhaust the energy in that root system. If you only have one bush, you can easily do that. But if you've got 10 acres of it, that's a big challenge. So it's up to you whether you use it. One of these days, I want to take a soil sample right next to a stump that I have painted, maybe, I don't know, a couple of weeks later, and see whether any of that herbicide is actually in the soil, so that we don't have to guess. Is it really polluting the area around us, or is it not enough material to do that? I've been saying that for years, but one of these days I really do have to do that, so I can give you real information.
Would you do the same for the barberry?
Yeah, all the woodies, autumn olive. The big one down here now is porcelain berry. I don't know if you have that yet, but if you don't, you will. It's the kudzu of the north. So it's a woody vine, looks a lot like grape. But same thing, you cut it off at the base, paint it.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, someone else asked a question. I don't know if you saw this one, Karen, that they tried to plant milkweed seeds from the field, and they planted it before winter and none came up. Is there a trick? Yeah,
well, milkweed seeds are particularly tough. In some populations, almost 90% are not viable. So if you're starting from seed, milkweed's one of the worst things to try with because you'll get discouraged. The easiest thing for milkweed, there are two easy ways to propagate milkweeds. One is to simply buy plugs. If it's not a huge area, that works really well because those guys, the professionals, have germinated the seeds and you just buy the plugs and plant them. The other way is if you have some mature milkweed stands on your property, you can dig up some of the roots and cut them into maybe 1.5 inch sections, the fatter roots, at least 1/4 inch thick, and just plant that little root system, and a new milkweed plant will grow up from that. And so you can dig up one complete milkweed rammet with all of its root system and get 10, 12 new plants out of that. So that's particularly easy as well.
Okay, we have another one. I recently read an organic farming blog post that recommended leaving the knotweed and invasive in, partly because it's one of the latest blooming and is good for pollinators. Is this good advice, especially since knotweed is so hard to remove?
It's terrible advice. Which pollinators is it good for? They're talking about the honeybee, and the honeybee certainly does go there. And it blooms for what? A week and a half. So here you're taking huge areas out of production that could be having flowering plants all season long and replacing it with a plant that blooms for a week. To help primarily the honeybee. Now, we want to help our honeybees, but we got to help those 4,000 species of native bees, 1,300 of which are specialists, none of which are going to use Japanese knotweed. And that goes for privet, it goes for autumn olive, it goes for all of these things that people are leaving to help the pollinators. It doesn't help the pollinator community, and it only helps them briefly. Privet down south covers more than 1 million acres, and it blooms for a week. And the honeybee people say, oh, we got to leave it. Well, 1 million acres that could be planted with a sequence of flowering plants. So yeah, terrible ecological advice.
Okay. How do I control Asiatic beetle grubs without using destructive products?
I don't know. It's the same old problem. We bring in these non-native insects, and controlling them is really, really hard, particularly the things that live in the soil. I mean, they're down there with Japanese beetle. I mean, Japanese beetle is a type of Asiatic beetle. They're all scarabs. They're really numerous. I do not have an answer. We talk about milky spore disease controlling Japanese beetle, and when done properly over a period of years, it can exert some control. But Japanese beetle as a larva and those Asian beetles are, they're grass specialists. And when you've got 40 million acres of grass, you're giving them everything they need. So no wonder you make a lot of beetles. That's the way to really control them. Get rid of what they eat as larvae.
Okay, here's another tough one. Any suggestions on how to deal with neighbors who spray for mosquitoes? We are surrounded by them.
Yeah. If they were releasing smallpox spores, somebody would speak up and say, what you do in your property is not just staying on your property. And that's the same with those mosquito sprays. I am surprised. We're such a litigious society. I am surprised that there haven't been lawsuits over this. But it just shows how low down we rank the biodiversity in our properties. It's just not important. We're not gonna worry about it. In my view, they do not have the right to kill your ecosystem, all for something that doesn't work. My guess is they don't realize that. Ideally, you would have a good relationship with your neighbor, and you can actually explain what's going on. But neighbors are tricky, Would somebody please ask me a question I can answer?
Okay, here's one. How do shaded areas compare in insect user friendliness to sunnier areas? My half acre has a serious canopy, which we love. I'm having terrible luck with plantings. I've tested my soil, but I think I have a number of different soil types. Your thoughts?
Yeah, but remember, well, the answer is that shaded areas do not produce as many insects. You can have, there are a lot of plants that do well in the shade, and what they're doing is they're hanging in there till one of your canopy trees dies, and then they're there ready to take off. A healthy understory planting is not just shrubs, it's young canopy trees that are just hanging out there, and they could be hanging out there for decades until there's a sunspot that opens up. That's normal, but are those the places producing a lot of insects? No, they're really not. But remember, your canopy is. So just because you're not producing them on the ground doesn't mean your trees are not producing them. So you've got shade down there, but the top of your canopy that you can't appreciate because you're not seeing it is doing a lot of the work.
Okay, how to deal with buckthorn trees is the next one.
Well, it's another woody that does well to cutting and painting.
Okay.
If you go out and you just cut, which a lot of these big buckthorn removal projects do, and then they go away, and the Boy Scouts go home, and 2 weeks later they're all coming up from the roots, and you're back where you started from. So whatever can kill the root system, and I just don't know of any way to do it other than herbicide. But I would cut and paint. I would not spray everything that's out there. Under those buckthorns, you can have small oaks. You can have a few other things that are there because they were protected from the deer. So that's another thing. Once you remove the major invasive, you've got to protect those young natives from the deer because they eat every one of them.
Okay. Next one. Jean says, can you help us understand how to integrate our bird feeding practice on a small property, 5,300 square feet, in a densely populated suburban downtown New England town? How are we impacting our backyard biome, and what advisement can you give us? We have a mix of native and non-native woody plants and trees. Thank you.
Well, every keystone native plant you put in your yard is a bird feeder. So even if it's just one, you've planted a bird feeder. You certainly can, without changing your plants at all, you can use real bird feeders, and they're great in the wintertime for birds that don't migrate. For some of the birds that don't migrate, they're not going to help the insectivores, and there's a lot of the seed eaters that don't go to our bird feeders either. Many of the sparrows and things just pick up seeds off the ground and the grasses and things. So even if you have a small plot, the herbaceous plants that you have in the fall, don't deadhead them. Those are the seeds that those birds will eat all winter long. Your goldfinches will eat your black-eyed Susan seeds and your evening primrose seeds and stuff if you don't cut them off. So there are a lot of things you can do on a small property, but I certainly will admit you can't do as much on a small property as you can on a bigger property. But remember, the things using your property don't know where your property lines are. So the object is for you to do it and your neighbor to do it and your other neighbor, and all of a sudden you've got an entire neighborhood that is more ecologically sound. And then you can divide up the jobs. So the person with a lot of shade, maybe 3 houses down, they've got a lot of sun. So the sun person can put in the pollinator garden. If your shade is surrounded by big oaks, you're covering the basic part of the food web by making all those caterpillars. And you look at your entire ecosystem as at the neighborhood scale, as opposed to just your tiny property. Maybe you can even get to know your neighbors.
Solves a few problems. Okay, if I kill off a stand of Norway maples, how long will the area take to regenerate and become usable for other species?
Well, it'll start regenerating right away. Norway maples, did you say Norway spruce or Norway maples?
Norway maples.
Norway maples throw really deep shade. So it's very difficult to grow anything under a Norway maple. And if you get rid of the Norway maples, all of a sudden you've got sun. So there's 2 ways you can rejuvenate that. You can do it by, it's called addition by subtraction, where you don't actually plant anything. You simply monitor it and take out everything you don't want. So if an autumn olive comes in, you pull it out, and you just keep doing that and leave the natives that come in. Or you can purposely plant it and say, I really want this and this and this, and you plant them, and then it's there right away. Whatever you plant, though, I suggest you plant it small, because it will establish its root system and be a much healthier plant. If you got to bypass that instant gratification. You know, if you get rid of a big tree and all of a sudden there's a blank space, people want to put another big tree back. But you'll spend thousands of dollars for a tree that's root pruned really seriously and has a 50% chance of dying. And then we'll spend a decade trying to rebuild that root system. It'll never be as healthy as a small tree, very small, that you put in that gets to build that root system right from the start.
Okay, a couple more. I have a lot of moss on a shaded yard. Is moss good for pollinators?
Moss is a great ground cover. It is, it's preventing erosion. It's holding moisture. It's doing a lot for all the soil organisms. But no, it's not producing anything for pollinators. It's okay. It's okay. If you've got moss, you've got a lot of shade. If you've got shade, you've got canopy plants making that shade. So if they're important canopy plants, you're doing your job. A lot of people, they give their eye teeth for a moss garden. So consider yourself lucky.
Okay, last one we've got here is from Carol. What about nematodes for grubs before Japanese beetle? I'm not sure if I understand that, but maybe you do.
Yeah, no, there are nematode products. I haven't kept up with that, but they're, nematodes, there are lots of kinds of nematodes, and many of them are essentially parasitoids. They penetrate the body of their host and eat it and kill it. And I believe there are species-specific nematodes that will attack those grubs in your yard, and that would be a way to possibly control all the Asian beetles, including Japanese beetle. To give you the specifics of that, I'd have to see what's been happening, but I haven't followed nematode work in the last 10 years, and I'm going to write that down because I should. Good point. So this would be a product that you buy. And you simply, sprinkle it out over your soil, and little nematode spore type things, and they will hatch and hopefully do a good job. I know that milky spore has never lived up to its reputation, but maybe nematodes will do better.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we've gotten, unless somebody else has another one they want to add.
I want to just ask one. I can see around my compost a lot of grubs, not grubs, I'm sorry.
Worms.
I see the worms, yep, and also the slugs. Do the birds
Yeah.
enjoy the slugs?
I've never seen a bird eat a slug. You know, we did another project. The same Ashley Kennedy did another citizen science project where people were sending in photos of birds eating things, and I don't think one of them had a slug out of the thousands of pictures she had. But box turtles eat slugs. So if you have any box turtles, you're helping them. Most of the slug species that we have, particularly in the East, are non-native from Europe.
Okay.
Box turtles don't seem to care, but not many things eat them.
Okay, so I don't have to feel bad if I don't have box turtles and I put out beer and drown them?
Probably not. Probably not.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Karen, do you see any other questions?
No, I think we've covered them all.
Okay. All right. Doug, thank you very, very much for this
You're
talk.
welcome. You're
Thank
welcome.
you. We appreciate it. There was a lot there. And what I'll try to do is I'll try to make a list of some native books on native plants, some of the other things that you mentioned, and make a list and send it out to the people who participated. And this was wonderful. There's a lot here. I know I have a barberry and a firebush that
Boy.
yeah, I know. That needs to be knocked down dead. Yeah. And what about those red maples? I have a red maple that
Red maples are good. They're good.
And underneath, I keep trying to plant things. I might have to go for the ferns and the
Yeah.
native ginger.
Yeah. Wild ginger's great.
Yep. Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone who came tonight. I will send out some resources, and this was just wonderful. So thank you very much, Doug.
Thanks for listening. All right.
Yep.
Take care, everybody.
Okay, you too. Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.
You
Bye
too.
now. All right. I think I'll end it for all. Karen, thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt you with the milkweed. Did you?
Oh, no,
I
I was just trying to, there were so many. Oh, somebody just put one in the Q&A just now. Oh, just to thank you. Okay.